The Soviet-Afghan War began not with columns of tanks crossing a border, but with a series of miscalculations rooted in Cold War ideology, regional instability, and a profound misunderstanding of Afghanistan itself, a country whose geography, social structure, and political culture had repeatedly defeated outside powers long before the Soviet Union ever considered intervention. Throughout much of the 20th century, Afghanistan existed on the margins of global politics, formally neutral yet strategically significant, situated at the crossroads of Central Asia, South Asia, and the Middle East, and serving as a buffer between empires rather than a prize to be directly controlled. After the Second World War, as the Cold War hardened into a global contest, both Washington and Moscow viewed Afghanistan less as an end in itself than as a piece on a larger strategic chessboard, a state whose alignment mattered primarily because of its proximity to Soviet Central Asia and to the oil-rich Persian Gulf. For decades, the Soviet Union cultivated influence in Afghanistan through economic aid, infrastructure projects, and military training, presenting itself as a modernizing partner rather than a colonial power, while Afghan leaders attempted to balance Soviet support with non-alignment, seeking to preserve autonomy amid superpower rivalry. This precarious balance began to unravel in the 1970s as internal Afghan politics grew increasingly volatile, driven by social inequality, ethnic divisions, and the tension between traditional rural life and a small but radicalized urban intelligentsia inspired by Marxist ideology. In 1973, a bloodless coup overthrew the Afghan monarchy, replacing it with a republic that promised reform but delivered instability, opening the door for more radical forces to compete for power within the state. The decisive rupture came in April 1978 with the Sour Revolution, when the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, a Marxist-Leninist organization deeply divided into rival factions, seized power in a violent coup that killed President Mohammad Daoud Khan and much of his family, instantly transforming Afghanistan from a fragile republic into a revolutionary socialist state aligned with Moscow. The new regime, dominated by the Khalq faction of the PDPA, moved with startling speed to impose sweeping reforms, including land redistribution, changes to marriage laws, literacy campaigns, and the suppression of religious authority. Reforms that might have been contentious, even in a stable society, but proved explosive in a country where power was decentralized, tribal loyalties were paramount, and Islam shaped everyday life. These policies were enforced through coercion rather than consensus, accompanied by mass arrests, executions, and the brutal repression of dissent, rapidly alienating large segments of the population and igniting armed resistance across the countryside. Instead of consolidating power, the revolutionary government found itself isolated, embattled, and dependent on Soviet support to survive, a dependency that deepened as factional infighting paralyzed leadership and undermined any coherent strategy for governance. From Moscow's perspective, events in Afghanistan were increasingly alarming, not because the country was vital in itself, but because the collapse of a friendly regime on the Soviet Union's southern border threatened to expose Central Asia to instability, insurgency, and foreign influence at a moment when détente with the West was already fraying. Soviet leaders initially resisted direct military involvement, haunted by memories of costly interventions elsewhere and wary of becoming trapped in a guerrilla war, preferring instead to provide advisors, weapons, and economic aid while urging Afghan leaders to moderate their policies and reconcile with opposition forces. These efforts failed catastrophically as the PDPA's internal struggles culminated in the rise of Hafizullah Amin, a ruthless and erratic leader whose consolidation of power included the assassination of his predecessor, and whose behavior convinced many in Moscow that he was both incapable of stabilizing the country and potentially unreliable as an ally. Intelligence reports painted a grim picture of an Afghan state on the brink of collapse, with insurgent groups expanding their reach, government control shrinking to major cities, and the legitimacy of the regime eroding beyond repair. Compounding these fears was the broader Cold War context of the late 1970s, marked by the Iranian Revolution, the overthrow of a key American ally, and growing anxiety within the Kremlin that the southern flank of the Soviet Union was becoming dangerously unstable, vulnerable to Islamist movements and Western influence alike. Within the Soviet leadership, debates intensified over how to respond, pitting caution against perceived necessity, as some argued that intervention would entangle the USSR in an unwinnable conflict, while others warned that failure to act would result in the loss of Afghanistan and potentially inspire unrest within Soviet Central Asia. The decision-making process was opaque, driven by a small circle of aging leaders operating within a system that rewarded conformity and worst-case thinking. And as the situation in Kabul deteriorated further, the balance tipped toward action. In December 1979, Soviet forces crossed into Afghanistan under the guise of stabilizing the country and assisting a friendly government, swiftly eliminating Amin and installing Babrak Karmal, a rival PDPA leader deemed more reliable and controllable, in what Moscow hoped would be a limited intervention to restore order and withdraw once stability was achieved. This assumption would prove disastrously wrong, as the presence of foreign troops transformed a fragmented insurgency into a nationwide jihad, uniting disparate resistance groups under the banner of expelling an occupying power and drawing Afghanistan into the center of a proxy war that would consume the next decade. What the Soviet leadership underestimated was not merely the resilience of Afghan resistance, but the extent to which their intervention would internationalize the conflict, attracting support from Pakistan, the United States, Saudi Arabia, and others who saw in Afghanistan an opportunity to bleed their Cold War rival. The initial Soviet operation achieved its immediate objectives with military efficiency, seizing key installations and asserting control over Kabul, but it also crossed a psychological threshold, converting political instability into open war and ensuring that the Soviet Union would become directly responsible for a conflict it neither fully understood nor could easily escape. From the outset, the war exposed a fundamental mismatch between Soviet doctrine and Afghan reality, as an army designed for mechanized warfare on the plains of Europe found itself fighting an elusive enemy in some of the most forbidding terrain on Earth, where loyalty shifted by village, supply lines were fragile, and victory could not be measured by territory held alone. The invasion shocked the international community, shattering remaining illusions of détente and prompting condemnation, sanctions, and the boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics, while also signaling a turning point in the Cold War, as Afghanistan became the arena in which superpower rivalry would be waged through proxies, ideology, and attrition rather than direct confrontation. For the Afghan people, the arrival of Soviet troops marked the beginning of a prolonged catastrophe. As war spread into every province, civilian life was upended, and the country was drawn into a cycle of violence whose consequences would extend far beyond the Cold War itself. The Soviet-Afghan War thus began as a limited intervention born of fear and miscalculation, but it would evolve into a grinding conflict that tested the limits of Soviet power, reshaped regional politics, and left an enduring legacy of instability whose effects would be felt long after the last foreign soldier withdrew. As Soviet forces settled into Afghanistan in early 1980, the illusion that the intervention could be brief and controlled dissolved rapidly as resistance intensified across the countryside, and the conflict revealed itself not as a conventional war to be won decisively, but as a diffuse, grinding struggle fought village by village, valley by valley, against an enemy that blended seamlessly into the population and drew strength from terrain, tradition, and belief. The Soviet military entered the war equipped with overwhelming firepower, armor, and air superiority. Yet, these advantages translated poorly into the realities of Afghan combat, where narrow mountain passes, rugged highlands, and remote rural settlements neutralized mechanized doctrine and limited the effectiveness of large formations. The Mujahideen, a loose coalition of Islamist and nationalist resistance groups, exploited these conditions with devastating effectiveness, relying on ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, and local knowledge to harass Soviet convoys, disrupt supply lines, and impose constant psychological pressure on occupying forces. What united these disparate groups was not centralized command or ideology alone, but a shared opposition to foreign occupation and a narrative of jihad that framed the conflict in religious and existential terms, transforming resistance into a moral obligation that transcended tribal and ethnic divisions. Soviet commanders initially responded with tactics honed for conventional warfare, launching large-scale sweeps and search-and-destroy operations intended to clear insurgent strongholds and assert control, only to find that success was fleeting as fighters melted away under pressure and re-emerged once troops withdrew, leaving behind devastated villages and alienated civilians rather than lasting stability. The reliance on heavy firepower, including artillery, airstrikes, and helicopter gunships, inflicted severe damage on rural communities, accelerating displacement and feeding resentment that drove more Afghans into the ranks of the resistance, creating a self-reinforcing cycle in which military action deepened the very insurgency it sought to suppress. Within the Soviet ranks, morale suffered as soldiers confronted an enemy they could rarely see, and a mission whose objectives grew increasingly opaque, compounded by harsh living conditions, extended deployments, and the psychological toll of constant ambush and loss. Many conscripts arrived with little understanding of Afghanistan or the reasons for their presence there, and as casualties mounted, the disconnect between official rhetoric and lived experience eroded confidence in both leadership and purpose. Meanwhile, the Afghan government installed by Moscow struggled to establish legitimacy beyond urban centers, dependent on Soviet military support and plagued by corruption, factionalism, and mistrust. Its authority further undermined by its association with foreign troops and its inability to deliver security or meaningful reform. Attempts to win hearts and minds through development projects and political outreach were overshadowed by ongoing violence and the perception that the regime represented an imposed order rather than a national government, limiting its appeal even among those weary of war. As the conflict dragged on, the Soviet Union found itself increasingly isolated internationally, facing condemnation, economic sanctions, and diplomatic fallout that deepened the strain on an already stagnating economy and reinforced the sense that Afghanistan had become a strategic liability rather than a buffer. The war also drew in external actors with growing intensity, as Pakistan emerged as the primary conduit for support to the Mujahideen, providing sanctuary, training, and logistical networks that allowed resistance groups to survive and coordinate across borders, while the United States, Saudi Arabia, and others supplied funding, weapons, and intelligence as part of a deliberate effort to counter Soviet influence. This internationalization transformed Afghanistan into one of the Cold War's most significant proxy battlegrounds, where global rivalry intersected with local conflict in ways that magnified violence and prolonged suffering. For Soviet planners, the growing scale of foreign involvement confirmed fears that withdrawal would signal weakness and invite instability along the USSR's southern frontier, reinforcing the belief that persistence, rather than disengagement, was necessary to avoid strategic defeat. Yet this belief came at a mounting cost, as the war consumed resources, lives, and political capital with no clear prospect of victory, forcing leaders to confront the limits of military power in a conflict defined less by territorial control than by legitimacy and endurance. By the early 1980s, it was evident that Afghanistan had become a war of attrition, one in which the Soviet Union could inflict enormous damage without achieving decisive outcomes, while the resistance could endure indefinitely so long as it retained external support and local legitimacy. This asymmetry favored the insurgents, whose objectives were simple and existential, while Soviet goals remained complex and shifting, oscillating between stabilizing a client state, suppressing resistance, and preserving credibility in the broader Cold War contest. The longer the war continued, the more it exposed structural weaknesses within the Soviet system itself, as rigid command structures, limited adaptability, and political constraints hindered innovation and honest assessment, trapping decision-makers in a cycle of escalation without resolution. The conflict thus entered a phase of stalemate, characterized by periodic offensives, shifting front lines, and relentless violence, setting the stage for a prolonged struggle that would test the Soviet Union's capacity to sustain war far from home and raise fundamental questions about the costs of empire in a world increasingly shaped by asymmetrical conflict. As the war ground on through the early and mid-1980s, the Soviet-Afghan conflict evolved into a brutal test of endurance that exposed the widening gap between military effort and political outcome. As Soviet forces expanded their presence and refined their tactics, while the underlying dynamics of resistance remained stubbornly unchanged. Commanders adapted incrementally, placing greater emphasis on air mobility, special forces operations, and the use of helicopter gunships to insert troops into remote areas, disrupt supply routes, and pursue insurgent bands across difficult terrain. Yet these adaptations yielded only temporary advantages, as the Mujahideen adjusted in turn, dispersing their forces, improving coordination, and exploiting the limitations of Soviet intelligence and logistics. The war increasingly revolved around control of key valleys, mountain passes, and population centers. But even when these areas were secured through overwhelming force, Soviet control proved fragile, dependent on constant presence, and vulnerable to renewed attack once units redeployed. The countryside became a contested space defined by fear and uncertainty, where civilians navigated shifting allegiances in order to survive, and where the distinction between combatant and non-combatant blurred under the pressure of collective punishment, reprisals, and coercion. The humanitarian cost of this strategy was devastating, as entire regions were depopulated through bombardment and displacement, creating millions of refugees who fled to Pakistan and Iran, destabilizing neighboring states and deepening the international dimension of the conflict. Inside the Soviet Union, the war's toll became increasingly difficult to conceal as casualties mounted, and stories of corruption, drug abuse, and poor conditions filtered back through informal networks, undermining official narratives of progress and exposing a disconnect between propaganda and reality. Families received death notices with little explanation, while wounded veterans returned to a society ill-prepared to support them. their experiences often marginalized or silenced in a system that struggled to acknowledge the war's human cost. This silence bred resentment and disillusionment, particularly among younger generations who questioned the purpose of a conflict that seemed remote from their lives, yet exacted a heavy price. Within the Afghan resistance, external support grew more sophisticated and decisive as foreign backers supplied increasingly advanced weapons, including portable anti-aircraft missiles that challenged Soviet air superiority and altered the balance of power on the battlefield. The introduction of these systems forced Soviet pilots to fly higher and rely less on close air support, reducing the effectiveness of operations and emboldening insurgent forces, who now possessed the means to contest the skies as well as the ground. This shift had a profound psychological impact, signaling that the resistance could adapt technologically as well as tactically, and reinforcing the perception that the Soviet Union was no longer in control of the conflict's trajectory. Politically, the war strained relations within the socialist bloc, as allies questioned the wisdom of prolonged intervention and distanced themselves from Moscow's policy, while in the non-aligned world, the invasion continued to damage Soviet credibility and fuel suspicion of its intentions. The conflict also reshaped global jihadist networks, as foreign fighters were drawn to Afghanistan, gaining combat experience and ideological reinforcement that would have consequences long after the Cold War ended, though at the time these dynamics remained secondary to the immediate strategic calculus of bleeding AAE, superpower. Within the Soviet leadership, assessments of the war grew increasingly pessimistic, as internal reports acknowledged the improbability of decisive victory and the corrosive effect of prolonged conflict on morale, discipline, and economic resources. Yet, institutional inertia and fear of reputational loss impeded meaningful change. The war had become entangled with perceptions of Soviet strength and resolve, making withdrawal appear tantamount to defeat and emboldening those who argued that persistence, however costly, was preferable to the consequences of retreat. This logic trapped policymakers in a conflict they privately doubted but publicly defended, reinforcing a cycle in which military escalation substituted for political strategy. As the decade progressed, Afghanistan came to symbolize the limits of Soviet power, revealing that conventional military superiority could not overcome deeply rooted local resistance, external support, and the absence of legitimate political authority. The conflict's protracted nature eroded confidence not only in specific leaders, but in the system that produced them, as the gap between ambition and capability became increasingly visible. By the mid-1980s, the war had reached a critical juncture. As losses mounted, international pressure persisted, and the costs of continued occupation began to outweigh the perceived risks of withdrawal, setting the stage for a fundamental reassessment driven not by victory, but by exhaustion and the recognition that the conflict could not be resolved on terms originally envisioned. The turning point in the Soviet-Afghan War came not through a decisive battlefield defeat, but through a gradual shift in political reality within the Soviet Union itself, as the costs of the conflict collided with a broader crisis of governance and economic stagnation that made indefinite war increasingly untenable. By the time Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power in 1985, Afghanistan was widely regarded within the Soviet leadership as a bleeding wound, a phrase that captured both the human toll and the corrosive effect the war had on morale, legitimacy, and international standing. Unlike his predecessors, Gorbachev was willing to acknowledge publicly that the war could not be won through military means alone, and that continued occupation threatened to undermine the reforms he believed were essential to the survival of the Soviet system itself. This recognition did not translate immediately into withdrawal, as the leadership feared that a hasty exit would collapse the Afghan government and signal weakness to both allies and adversaries. But it did initiate a search for a political settlement that could preserve some measure of face while ending the conflict. Soviet strategy shifted toward reducing troop exposure, transferring responsibility to Afghan forces, and pursuing negotiations that would allow withdrawal under the cover of international agreement, a process complicated by the fragmented nature of the Afghan resistance and the competing interests of external sponsors. Militarily, the Soviets attempted to stabilize key urban centers and communication routes while scaling back large-scale offensives, a posture that reduced casualties but also conceded much of the countryside to insurgent control, effectively acknowledging the limits of occupation. Diplomatically, talks mediated by the United Nations gained momentum, bringing together representatives of Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Soviet Union, and the United States in an effort to formalize non-interference and establish a framework for withdrawal. These negotiations reflected a changing global climate, as both superpowers recognized the need to reduce tensions and manage rivalry more cautiously in an era of economic constraint and nuclear risk. The Geneva Accords of 1988 marked the culmination of this process, committing the Soviet Union to withdraw its forces in stages while securing assurances, however fragile, about external support for the resistance and the sovereignty of Afghanistan. When the withdrawal began in May 1988, it unfolded with deliberate symbolism, as Soviet columns crossed bridges and borders under the gaze of cameras and observers, transforming an act of strategic retreat into a controlled, orderly departure intended to project responsibility rather than defeat. For many Soviet soldiers, the withdrawal was bittersweet, a release from a brutal conflict, but also an acknowledgement that sacrifices made over nearly a decade had not produced the promised outcome. Within Afghanistan, the departure of Soviet troops did not bring peace, as the underlying political divisions and militarization of society ensured that war would continue in new forms. But it did end the chapter of direct superpower occupation that had defined the conflict's Cold War significance. Internationally, the withdrawal was widely interpreted as a setback for Soviet power, reinforcing perceptions of decline and emboldening critics who saw Afghanistan as evidence that the USSR could no longer sustain costly foreign interventions. Domestically, the war left deep scars, contributing to a broader reckoning with the failures of the Soviet system and accelerating demands for transparency, accountability, and reform. The experience of Afghanistan undermined faith in official narratives and exposed the human cost of decisions made by a small, insulated elite, lessons that resonated powerfully during the final years of the Soviet Union. The war's end thus coincided with a moment of profound transition, as the Soviet state itself began to unravel under the weight of economic crisis, political reform, and loss of ideological confidence. In this context, Afghanistan came to be remembered not as an isolated misadventure, but as a catalyst that revealed systemic weaknesses and hastened the end of an era. The Soviet-Afghan War closed not with victory or resolution, but with withdrawal and uncertainty, leaving behind a devastated country, a disillusioned generation of veterans, and a legacy of instability that would outlast the Cold War itself, while serving as a stark reminder of the limits of military power in conflicts rooted in local legitimacy, identity, and belief. The long shadow of the Soviet-Afghan War extended far beyond the moment the last Soviet troops crossed the border, as the conflict's consequences unfolded over years and continents, reshaping Afghanistan, destabilizing the region, and reverberating through the global order in ways that few participants had anticipated at the outset. In Afghanistan itself, the withdrawal of Soviet forces removed one pillar of the conflict, but left behind a heavily militarized society fractured by ideology, ethnicity, and warlordism, as the Afghan government struggled to survive without direct Soviet military support, while resistance groups, emboldened by years of external backing and battlefield success, turned their weapons toward one another in a brutal civil war. The collapse of central authority unleashed cycles of violence that devastated cities, displaced millions, and eroded the social fabric, ensuring that the end of superpower involvement did not bring peace, but merely transformed the nature of conflict. Regionally, the war reshaped Pakistan's internal dynamics, strengthening its intelligence services and entrenching militant networks that had been nurtured as instruments of Cold War strategy. While the influx of refugees and weapons destabilized border regions and altered political balances in ways that would persist for decades. Internationally, the conflict marked a decisive moment in Cold War history, as the Soviet Union's inability to achieve its objectives undermined perceptions of its strength and accelerated a broader loss of confidence among allies and adversaries alike, reinforcing the sense that the global balance was shifting irreversibly. Within the United States and its partners, Afghanistan was often framed as proof that determined proxy resistance could defeat a superpower, a narrative that encouraged confidence in indirect strategies, even as it obscured the long-term costs imposed on the societies where such conflicts were fought. For the Soviet Union, the war became a symbol of systemic failure, exposing flaws in decision-making, intelligence, and adaptability that reformers cited as evidence of the need for radical change. While conservatives struggled to defend policies whose human and economic costs were increasingly undeniable. The veterans of Afghanistan, known as the Afghancy, returned to a society ill-equipped to absorb their trauma, their experiences often marginalized in official discourse, but preserved in literature, music, and memory as a counter-narrative to state propaganda. These personal stories contributed to a growing culture of skepticism and dissent that weakened the moral authority of the Soviet state during its final years. The ideological consequences of the war were equally profound, as the conflict discredited the notion that socialist internationalism could justify armed intervention, reinforcing a turn inward that would shape Soviet foreign policy until the state's collapse. At the same time, the mobilization of transnational Islamist fighters during the war created networks and narratives that outlived the Cold War, redirecting skills and ideologies forged in Afghanistan toward new conflicts and targets, with consequences that would define global security debates in the decades that followed. The Soviet-Afghan War thus occupies a unique place in history, standing at the intersection of Cold War rivalry and post-Cold War instability, a conflict whose immediate objectives were overtaken by unintended outcomes that reshaped the world long after the original strategic calculations had faded. Its legacy challenges simple narratives of victory and defeat, revealing instead a complex web of consequences in which superpower ambition, local resistance, and external intervention combined to produce outcomes no single actor fully controlled. In retrospect, the war illustrates how interventions justified by fear and ideology can unleash forces that outlast their sponsors, and how the costs of such decisions are often borne most heavily by those with the least influence over them. As the Cold War receded, Afghanistan remained a scar on the international system, a reminder that the end of superpower confrontation did not erase the conflicts it had fueled, but merely shifted their center of gravity. The Soviet-Afghan War therefore stands as both a culmination of Cold War interventionism and a prologue to a new era of global insecurity, underscoring the enduring lesson that military power, however vast, cannot substitute for political legitimacy, cultural understanding, and the consent of those whose lives are most directly affected by war. The final reckoning of the Soviet-Afghan War lies not in the battlefield statistics or diplomatic agreements that marked its end, but in the way it exposed the limits of Cold War power and accelerated the collapse of assumptions that had governed superpower behavior for decades. As a conflict intended to secure influence, instead revealed vulnerability, exhaustion, and the inability of force to impose political solutions in deeply rooted societies. For the Soviet Union, Afghanistan became a mirror, reflecting the deeper crises afflicting the state, from economic stagnation and bureaucratic inertia to the moral bankruptcy of decisions made without public consent or accountability. And the war's legacy fed directly into the loss of confidence that accompanied the final years of Soviet existence. The experience shattered the myth of ideological inevitability, demonstrating that revolutionary rhetoric could not compensate for cultural ignorance, that military superiority could not overcome local legitimacy, and that interventions framed as defensive could generate outcomes far more destabilizing than the threats they sought to contain. For Afghanistan, the war marked a devastating rupture whose consequences extended far beyond the Cold War, as the destruction of institutions, the normalization of violence, and the proliferation of armed factions ensured that the country would remain trapped in cycles of conflict long after the superpowers that fought over it moved on. The global implications were equally enduring, as the war reshaped how states understood proxy conflict, insurgency, and the unintended consequences of external support, revealing that victories measured in strategic terms could conceal humanitarian catastrophes and long-term instability. In this sense, the Soviet-Afghan War stands as one of the Cold War's most consequential failures, not because it ended in dramatic defeat, but because it eroded the foundations of power from within, hastening the end of a system already strained by its contradictions. The war demonstrated that fear-driven intervention could entangle even the most powerful states in conflicts they neither understood nor controlled, and that withdrawal, once delayed too long, carried costs nearly as severe as continued occupation. As history moved forward, Afghanistan remained a testament to these lessons, a place where Cold War rivalries left scars that outlasted the ideologies that produced them, and where the human cost of geopolitical calculation was measured not in treaties or doctrines, but in generations shaped by war. The Soviet-Afghan War thus endures as a cautionary tale at the intersection of empire, ideology, and resistance, reminding future powers that the pursuit of influence through force often sows the seeds of decline, and that the true consequences of intervention are rarely confined to the moment of decision, but unfold over decades in ways no strategist can fully foresee.